Astronomy in Reverse by Pansley. Chapter 19. It came from the water. He can feel the body in his arms through the deep haze of sleep. Bucky doesn't need to open his eyes to remember. There's a weight on him, warm and heavy, but the pressure is somehow comforting. It's entirely unfamiliar, but for the first time in longer than he can remember, the lack of familiarity doesn't terrify him. He blinks his eyes open, sees the pristinely white ceiling high above him, then looks down at his chest at the mop of gold hair. He shifts slightly so he can see Steve's bare shoulders, his metal arm wrapped around the man's back and keeping him pressed to his chest. Steve stirs, as if sensing that Bucky's awake, and tilts his head back to blink up at him.
Morning.
Bucky smiles. Steve smiles back, sleepily and content to stay that way.
Morning yourself.
Bucky tightens his arm around Steve's back, kisses the top of his head. This is new to him. It's dizzying in some ways to think of last night. The intimacy had set his nerves on fire with its intensity and unfamiliarity, but Steve was there to immediately soothe them again like a cooling balm. The knife-sharp edge of hands on his skin couldn't last when he looked up and saw the face attached to them. Every day he remembers more and more of Steve, before the war and even during it. Just fragments, little flashes of the two of them at different ages throughout the years, some things understandably memorable, and others confusingly mundane. He remembers sleeping next to him, sharing a bed when they were kids, sharing a tent when they were soldiers. But he can't remember Steve the way he saw him last night, no matter how deeply he looks. He doesn't ask if it was the first time. He doesn't need to know. It's irrelevant to him if Bucky Barnes was ever in love with Steve Rogers, if they ever had each other the way he had him last night. That hot, aching hunger he feels for the other man is his own. He doesn't care why he wants him. He only cares that Steve wants him back. You have no idea how long I've wanted this, Steve had said, tussling with him in the sheets. Bucky hadn't asked if he meant weeks or years or decades. What did it matter how long they've wanted each other or why? It didn't change that he wanted him last night as fiercely as he wants him now. Bucky cups the back of Steve's head and tilts it back to face him, then leans down and kisses him. Steve kisses back lazily, then is all at once fully awake and rolling on top of him, his weight considerable but inflaming that warm, pleasurable feeling in his gut. His hands move down Steve's back slowly, tracing each hard line of muscle with the tips of his fingers until he reaches his hips. He can't help but roll his hips when he takes the swell of Steve's ass into his hands, squeezing appreciatively and making Steve laugh against his lips. Sorry, Steve says, breaking away from the kiss and grimacing apologetically. Probably got morning breath. Bucky shrugs, moving his hands back up to Steve's hips as the man sits upright on top of him, straddling him.
We could continue in the shower.
Steve grins playfully down at him, running his hands along Bucky's chest and stopping at his shoulders. That's tempting. He slides down the length of his body, then collapses on top of him with his head resting against Bucky's shoulder like a giant muscular cat. But I want to stay in bed with you like this for as long as possible.
When did you become such a bed potato? I remember you used to keep me awake at the crack of dawn whenever we made camp.
We're not at war now, Steve yawns. What's a bed potato?
It's like a couch potato, but for beds.
A puff of breath tickles against his skin as Steve chuckles into his chest. Another slang term you picked up from Peter, I'm guessing?
Or Ned. It's not even the weirdest one they've come up with. Do you know what a meme is?
No, Steve says, then after a pregnant pause. Do you?
Nope, not a clue.
They laugh, Bucky hugging Steve to his chest a moment longer before sighing and letting him go. I think I need that shower, actually. Steve kisses his shoulder, then rolls off of him, stretching his arms above his head and drawing Bucky's gaze down to his chest and to the sharp, pronounced muscles in his lower abdomen. His hand twitches, wanting to reach out and touch.
Sure you don't want to join me?
In a minute, Steve says, smiling up at him as he stretches his legs next languidly. Go ahead, I'm right behind you.
Uh-huh. Don't fall back asleep.
Feel free to wake me up if I do. Smiling, Bucky heads for the ensuite bathroom, stopping in front of the sink to brush his teeth. His gaze trails the dark pattern of hickeys along the column of his throat, his shoulder, and the deep ridges of his collarbones, seemingly beginning to fade away already, though barely. It's odd looking at himself. He knows it's ridiculous, but Stark's extravagantly expensive mirrors almost seem clearer than the ones he's used to, better lit at the very least. He can see details in his face he's never noticed before, how badly he needs a haircut and a shave. He grabs the razor, figuring Steve won't mind, but doesn't get the chance to reach for the shaving cream before he hears Peter anxiously calling, "Hey, Steve, are you in there?" There's knocking on the door, loud and somewhat frantic. Peter's voice filters in without giving either of them a chance to reply. Dad wasn't in his room or the kitchen, and I've looked everywhere else, and I'm kind of freaking out. Bucky rips open the bathroom door just as Steve answers the one to the bedroom. Neither of them are able to get a word out before Peter continues rambling. "I went to wake him up because Mr. Sark said Mr. T'Challa's on the phone and wants to talk to us, but now I can't find him anywhere, and he doesn't have what we—" Peter. Bucky steps forward into the kid's line of sight, cutting him off mid-word as their eyes meet. Relief floods Peter's face before he takes the whole picture in. The two of them, dressed in nothing but sweatpants, the rest of their clothes strewn across the floor. The unmade bed, the splattering of dark cakes covering Bucky, and the light ones covering Steve. Steve's hair is sticking up every which way like he's just jumped out of a moving plane. Again. Peter only looks confused for a second before it clicks. Bucky sees it, the realization washing over him, barreling him over like a tsunami. He sees it because Peter's face goes redder than the Iron Man suit, and then he grabs the door out of Steve's hands and slams it closed, angrily shouting, "Oh my God! Dad! At least get dressed before you answer the door! Gross!" He tries to call out an apology, but he hears Peter's retreating footsteps loud and urgent like he's running from the closed door. He stands there, mouth open, keeping it together until Steve looks back at him helplessly, and then he's collapsing onto the edge of the bed, laughing. Steve composes himself, running a hand through his hair. "Well, if you were wondering how to tell him, I guess we've taken care of that." "I think we traumatized him," Bucky says, forehead hanging in his hands. "Parenting is hard." Chuckling, Bucky peeks up at him through his fingers. "You have no idea. You sure you want to be part of this?" Stepping forward between his legs, Steve cups his face and leans down to kiss him. Bucky runs his hands up Steve's lower back reflexively in a way that feels almost natural, like it's instinctual to touch him. "I want to be a part of your life, and I want you to be a part of mine," Steve says, his hands on either side of Bucky's face, keeping their gazes locked together. Bucky takes him by the nape of his neck and brings his face down to kiss him again. "I could be a part of you right now," he offers. Steve laughs against his lips, deepening the kiss before pulling away. "We should probably go find out what T'Challa wants first," he says regretfully. "Chances are it's important, and I think Peter said they're waiting for us." The reminder of T'Challa kills the lingering mood, waking up next to Steve aghast, and Bucky merely nods and follows his lead of getting dressed. He catches Steve watching him as he pulls a borrowed pair of jeans up his legs, but the heat he feels in the pit of his stomach is muted under the thought of what could be waiting for him outside this room. Steve, as if sensing the tight coil of anxiety that's made its home in his gut, gently pulls him in by the nape of his neck and softly kisses his forehead. "It's okay," he says comfortingly. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." Bucky smiles at the words of comfort, but instead of soothing his anxiety, they add a layer of guilt to the tension in his body. He feels a sinking urge to see Peter all of a sudden, remembering the tremor in his voice when he thought Bucky was missing. He should be out there comforting his son, not in here accepting that comfort from Steve. They head for the main living room once they're fully dressed and find Tony and Peter waiting for them on one of the sofas. Peter's face goes red when he looks at Steve, but Bucky can see his nervousness in the way he's holding himself, the bouncing of his legs on the floor, the anxious tapping of his fingers on his kneecap. His shoulders are hunched, and even though Bucky can tell he's still completely embarrassed by what happened a few minutes ago, he looks at Bucky imploringly when their eyes meet, that terribly familiar look he gets when he needs to hear that everything's okay. Tony's expression couldn't be further in the opposite direction. He stares at Bucky, specifically at his collar area, in stark disbelief for what feels like a full 5 seconds before he gives Steve the most unimpressed look Bucky's ever seen. He almost laughs at the sight of it, and especially when Steve's cheeks go sheepishly pink under the heat of Stark's stare, and he pointedly looks away. He doesn't know why, but the knowledge that Tony is able to reduce Steve to an expression like that with a single look completely delights him. Thankfully, Tony doesn't dish out the lecture. He looks like he's stepping up, instead clearing his throat and evenly saying,
"Okay, T'Challa, the gang's all here."
"This won't take long,"
T'Challa says through Friday's speakers, his voice settling all around them the way the AI's does.
"I know who was responsible for the bombing in Vienna."
The four of them share a look of almost relieved disbelief. Steve speaks first, leaning forward despite the fact that T'Challa's hearing voice only. "Who was it?"
"His name was Baron Zemo."
A holographic screen opens in front of them, displaying the cold, emotionless face of a man Bucky doesn't recognize. Peter, Steve, and Tony all turn and look at him, but Bucky simply shakes his head, not knowing what to say.
"He doesn't look or sound familiar,"
he says apologetically.
"I don't know him."
"He certainly knows you," says T'Challa. "He's killed 3 Hydra agents trying to find you."
Steve's face darkens, his eyes narrowing until the blue of his irises seems impossibly black. Bucky's almost unnerved to see that kind of look on Steve's face, a kind of cold fury he never thought he was capable of until this very moment.
"He hasn't left any witnesses, so at the moment we don't know what his goal is. It's safe to assume that he is after the Winter Soldier. That's why he used your face to bomb the UN in Vienna, in order to flush you out of hiding."
T'Challa's smooth, even tone catches just slightly, almost instinctively, the barest hint of grief bleeding into it.
"Use my face?"
Bucky asks, a sick feeling swirling in his stomach.
"How the hell did he do that?"
"A mask. I confiscated it from his hotel room."
A cold feeling settles under his skin. He doesn't know this Baron Zemo guy, but that doesn't mean Hydra hasn't done something to cause this kind of bloody vendetta. He tries to search the broken, fragmented flashes in his memory, something he rarely does willingly, to try and find any missing link that connects him to this no longer nameless killer who used his face to murder dozens of innocent people. But nothing comes. Even the horribly, sickeningly clear memories he can recall of his mission debriefs and the horror that came after don't offer any solutions as to who this guy is and why he's killing people to find him. "Where is he now?" Steve asks. Bucky looks over at him and is surprised by how level his voice is, considering the tight, tense anger evident in his clenched fists, the way his jaw is set. The cold rage rolling off him in waves is almost dizzying. For a second, Bucky genuinely pities the Zemo guy.
"I will find him soon," T'Challa promises, "now that I know his face and his target. It's only a matter of time before I have him cornered. He will not get away with this, Captain."
"No," Steve agrees icily. "He won't." "It'd go faster if you'd let us help," says Tony, offering as politely as he's capable of. "We could team up and really nail this son of a bitch. 2 days stops." And there's actually a hint of amusement in T'Challa's reply.
"I appreciate the sentiment, Stark, but there's no need. This is my mission."
None of them jump at the chance to contradict him, not with the staunch level of conviction in the man's tone.
"Besides,"
he says a little lighter,
"you and Captain Rogers have your hands full. Ross grows increasingly restless. He wants those signatures on his accords."
Tony and Steve glance at each other wordlessly. A somewhat awkward silence falls between the four of them before Stark breaks his gaze away, sighs, and says, "Yeah, we're working on that."
"If you two can come to an agreement, the rest will follow,"
T'Challa says almost reassuringly.
"I will find Zemo and bring him to justice. In the meantime, you two must find the solution."
There's a sort of ageless, unmistakable wisdom in the man's voice, and though Bucky's not the one he's speaking to, he feels bolstered by his words. He's never even been to Wakanda, and yet he's comforted to realize that T'Challa will make a good king.
"Your team is counting on you."
Tony sighs dejectedly.
"Yes, sir,"
he says, out of the corner of his eye. Bucky sees Steve smirk. "We'll deal with Ross. Have fun on your murderer hunt."
"I will more than you in any case."
T'Challa's practically chuckling on the other end of the line.
"I will be in touch."
There's a short click, and then Friday says, "Prince T'Challa has disconnected." The four of them sit quietly for a minute, and then Peter smiles and says, "I like him." Bucky returns his smile, reaches over, and ruffles the kid's hair.
"Yeah, I like him too."
He looks to his right, where Steve is gazing down at his folded hands in his lap. Steve smiles at him when their eyes meet, but it's muted and tight, and it makes Bucky sigh and pull Peter to his feet as he stands.
Come on, Pete,
He says, taking the boy under his arm.
let's go cook up some breakfast.
Peter glances at Tony and Steve still on the couches, then realizes what Bucky is doing and says, "Can we make it outside? At the fire pit?"
Great idea.
He looks back at Steve and gives him a small reassuring smile. Steve nods back dutifully and turns to face Tony head on, so Bucky leads Peter out of the room to give them some privacy. Maybe it was the confidence in the child's tone, or maybe it's the good mood from last night and this morning spilling over onto everything else. But regardless, Bucky doesn't have a shred of doubt that the two of them will put this argument behind them if they're just given a chance. So he takes Peter down to the kitchen, and the two load up everything they'll need to cook breakfast outside, a sweet and easy peace laying warm and welcoming in his gut. It's such a calming feeling that Bucky doesn't even realize how quiet Peter's being until he's already building the campfire. He looks up sharply when the thought of... He hasn't said much. Hits him, and looks at Peter closely, trying to see what's wrong. But Peter looks calm and lost in thought, not hunched over and scared or anxious. He's just quiet, which is usually how Bucky knows that something's wrong. But he's used to being able to tell what when he looks at Peter, and not being able to doesn't sit well with him.
You okay, Pete?
He asks, startling the boy out of his thoughts, almost making him drop Orby in his lap. He tries to think of what could be on his mind, and when it finally comes to him, his face flushes a little, and he says,
Are you mad about earlier? About me and Steve?
Surprise colors the boy's face. Mad? He says like it's a word he's never heard before. No, Dad, I'm not. Why would I be mad?
I don't know.
Bucky admits.
Sometimes change can be upsetting, so I just thought,
Are things going to change?
they might change a little.
Bucky admits.
I don't really know what Steve is planning to do from now on in regards to us, but, well, if he wants to become a bigger part of our lives, then...
But will things change? Peter looks up at him, his voice small, a slight tremble in his lower lip. Between us?
What?
Bucky wraps his arm around the kid's shoulders immediately, wanting to pull him against his side, but not wanting Peter to look away from his face.
Peter, are you crazy? That's not the kind of change I was talking about.
When Peter tries to run away, he takes the boy's face in his hands to keep him looking at him.
Look, Steve might be around a lot more than you and me. That's not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere.
His hands fall from the boy's face to his thin shoulders. He squeezes reassuringly, despite how small and fragile Peter feels under his palms.
I know that. Steve knows that. How can you not know that?
Peter shakes his head, trying to hide the slight wet sheen in his eyes. I know that. It's irrational. It's just the thought of what if Steve wants to have a family with you, but not our family. I just hate it if you felt like you had to choose between Steve and...
That's not a choice, Peter.
He gives his shoulders a little shake, trying to knock some sense right into him.
You listen to me? That wouldn't even be a situation. I don't want to be with anybody who doesn't want to be a part of this. Doesn't matter who they are.
The hopeful look in Peter's eyes makes Bucky want to cry. It's almost insulting to think that Peter could still have doubts about what he means to him, about the lengths Bucky would go to keep them together. But he reminds himself of all the homes Peter has lost in his very short life over and over again, and tries not to take it personally.
You're my kid. Just because I didn't make you, doesn't mean I don't love you. And I'm going to expect as much from anybody I'm with, whether it's Steve or anyone else. If they can't think of you as their son too, then they're not the right person for me.
I don't want you to be unhappy, Peter says, sniffling. I don't want you to regret meeting me.
Peter, I regret so many things that I've done. Even someone as smart as you could never count them all.
He cups the boy's cheeks again, wipes away the tears running down them with the pads of his thumbs.
But I will never, ever regret meeting you.
Peter wraps his arms around his neck and hugs him tightly, burying his face in his shoulder so Bucky can't see him sob. But Bucky can still feel it in the slight tremor in Peter's back, in his arms and shoulders, as he wraps his own arms tightly around Peter's middle and crushes him against his chest, wanting him to get it, to know without a doubt that he's not going anywhere. Relief washes over him as he finally steps into the warm shower, the water steaming hot and soothing as it runs down his body. Steve and Tony never joined them at breakfast, so Peter offered to handle the cleanup so Bucky could finally take that shower he so badly wanted. He almost sighs as he tips his head back under the warm spray, his muscles loosening from the heat and gentle pummeling of the water on his skin. It dumbfounds him that Peter could ever believe he would let someone come between them. The idea of losing Steve now hurts, yes. The thought makes him dizzyingly nauseous when he pictures it, but if anything is capable of making him lose the feelings he's developed for the other man since that day he showed up in the kitchen, asking Bucky to choose between him and his son will be it. That's really the difference between him and Peter, he knows. Peter's had other families. He's had parents, he's had guardians, he's had foster siblings to take care of. He's witnessed families fall apart and people breaking their promises, and considering just how many people have come in and out of his life, and even just these last few years, everything probably feels terrifyingly temporary to him, even now. But for Bucky, Peter's it! He knows there was a family a long time ago, but he doesn't even have names to assign to them, let alone faces. He probably used to think of Steve as family, given just how many flashes of the man's face appear in his memories, but the way he feels about him now is something entirely new. And Steve would never ask him to do such a thing. It's almost laughable trying to imagine Steve telling him that he doesn't want to be together if Peter is in the picture. Steve's just not the type to be self-centered like that, let alone that dismissive. Even Peter has admitted that the idea is irrational. But just because it's irrational doesn't mean it's not a terrifying thought. And Bucky's heart aches for his kid, wondering how often Peter's plagued by thoughts of having his entire life ripped away from him. Again! It must be hell living like that, wondering when the other shoe will drop, when the good things will end like they always do, because nothing ever lasts. He sighs, closing his eyes as he shampoos his hair. Maybe he should talk to Tony later about ways to help Peter manage feeling like that. He's sure that kind of help would take resources, but given how close they've become since they were brought here, he doesn't think Tony would mind. He's a good guy. Maybe he should apologize to him for being so hostile in the beginning. Tony's a rude little shit, but he's stuck his neck out for them, even if it was only for Peter and Steve's sake at first. It's almost alarming when Bucky realizes belatedly that he likes Tony Stark, that he considers the other man a friend. It's an alien feeling. He has a son. He had a boss and acquaintances back in Queens, neighbors, familiar shopkeepers. But friendship? That almost sounds like something mythical, a thing that only happens to other people. Steve doesn't count. He doesn't know what Steve is, but it's not anywhere near the same realm as Tony. Everything about it feels different, even the things that logically should feel the same. Bantering with Steve shouldn't feel different than bantering with Tony, yet it does. Having Steve watch it from across the room should it feel different? Yet it does. The sight of Steve engaging with Peter, showing him kindness and attention and affection, shouldn't feel different than the annoyance turned resignation turned apathy he feels when it's Tony. But it does. It fills Bucky with an almost painful amount of tenderness when he sees Steve and Peter together, the smiles on both of their faces. His heart feels like it's ready to burst, the safest and happiest he can remember feeling in his entire life. His hair is still wet from the shower, dripping onto his shoulders and soaking through his shirt, but Bucky doesn't move to tie it up, not wanting to catch Steve and Peter's attention and ruin the moment he's spying on. He doesn't know where they got the wood from, but Steve is showing him how to arrange it, where to measure and cut so they can assemble it into what looks like the beginning of a bird feeder. He can barely hear their voices through the glass doors, watching them sitting on the deck as they work together, both of them smiling and laughing in the afternoon sun. It feels different. Tony Stark could one day become his best friend, and it wouldn't compare to this. Wouldn't compare to the sight of the two people he cares for most, smiling together, the happy, adoring look on Peter's face. That face he loves so much, his favorite thing in all the world. He's used to Peter looking at him like that. But seeing him give that look to Steve makes his heart feel just as full. He watches Orby make circles around the pair as they work, feeling like he's standing on the edge of a different world peering in. He decides to leave them, letting them have their time together, not wanting to spoil anything, least of all the hopeful thought of the two of them growing closer. Instead, he steps into the main living room, where Tony is lounging with 3 different holographic screens pulled up in front of him, somehow managing to work on all 3 at once. He doesn't acknowledge Bucky as he enters, his eyes darting furiously, showing his hands where to follow, almost just as fast.
You're dexterous.
Bucky observes aloud. Tony yelps and smacks one of the screens dead in the center, bringing up an array of angry red pop-ups. Oh my god, stop that!
Sorry.
He says, entirely not sorry.
You'd get startled less if you didn't zone out as much, you know.
You'd startle me less if you so much as cast a shadow, you goddamn apparition. Bucky grins, taking a seat on the couch across from the one the other man's sitting on.
What are you working on? Legal junk.
Tony says as he goes back to working, focused on the screens in front of him and apparently not bothered by Bucky staring at him through the slightly transparent holographs.
Steve and I are going to write up the first draft of our counter-proposal, so... Counter-proposal?
Surprise colors his tone.
For the Accords. Totally, that's great. Yeah, well, we'll see if they take the bait or not. Most likely not. We might end up having to fight our way out of this anyway, but...
He swallows, trying to hide how relieved he is, but it's clear as day on his face.
At least we'll all be fighting on the same side. There's a compromise, then.
Tony smiles at him through the screen.
A solution, as the child has so succinctly put it, gives me and hopefully the rest of the world the security they need for us to keep doing what we do, but lets us keep the freedom we need to actually do it.
He grimaces like he stepped in something foul.
Ross won't go for it. I already know what he'll say, but some of the UN counselors might. We just need to convince enough of them to push Ross out. That's kind of the immediate goal here.
He can't keep the smile off his face.
I know it was tough getting here, but you guys really came through. I'm glad you worked it out.
Yeah, Tony says.
Same here.
There's a lull then as Tony continues working away and Bucky turns to gaze out the large windows where the lake stretches on seemingly in infinite directions. He thinks he can hear Steve and Peter hammering their bird feeder together when he listens closely, but he's too far away to be sure. He thinks back to last night, to thoughts of Steve, but doesn't linger there. That's not the kind of thing he wants to imagine or even think of imagining while sitting across from Tony. Instead, he thinks of Peter, of the conclusion he came to earlier, and looks back at Tony resolutely.
I think Peter might have abandonment issues. A drunk toddler could have told you that, Tony snorts. What gave it away? The fact that he refuses to spend more than 4 minutes by himself, if that? Or was it the nervous breakdown he had when he found out about your and Steve's engagement that tipped you off? He didn't have a nervous breakdown.
Bucky frowns.
We didn't get engaged.
I didn't mean engagement. I meant like you engaged in... Never mind. He actually closes the screen directly in front of him and fixes Bucky with a blunt look. That kid spent weeks on the streets before he met you. Yeah, he was attending class during the day, but that kind of socialization only does so much for a kid mentally. He went weeks without anybody saying so much as a kind word to him, and before that, any attention he was given at all sounds like it was pretty abusive. He turns back to his screens as if needing to move his hands while he talks and wait to take the energy out of his limbs. Above all else, Peter's terrified of being alone. And look, for the record, I'm not blaming you at all. You did the best you could with what you had, and from what Peter tells me, you saved that kid's life. But he went from a crushingly lonely way of living to suddenly having all the love and attention he could want from somebody who frankly had nothing better to do but give it to him. Bucky doesn't know what to say, just watches Tony work numbly. So now I think he's gone kind of too far in the other direction. He's got some pretty serious separation anxiety, and maybe we'll get lucky, and with some normalcy and routine he'll overcome it. But you're not doing him any favors by suffocating him, Bucky. Do I suffocate him? Tony looks at him, his eyes dark, but not hostile. He doesn't see it that way. A feeling he can only describe as shame comes over him. He's known since the moment he laid eyes on Peter that he isn't good for him, for so many reasons. But it's disillusioning and even heartbreaking to realize that he's been failing the boy in more ways than he was even aware of. Sighing, Tony rubs his hand over his eyes regretfully. Hey, this isn't an attack, okay? It's good that we're talking about it. It means we can get you guys some help, get things on the up and up, all that jazz. He tries for what Bucky's sure is supposed to be a reassuring look, though it just looks pitched and uncomfortable. I meant what I said. I think you're a good dad. And more importantly, Peter does too. He's talked to you a lot, Bucky says, thinking loud. I don't want him going his whole life feeling like the rug's about to be pulled out from under his feet. I don't want him to feel like he has to build elaborate robots to stop someone from taking me away from him. I don't want him to be scared every time he leaves the house that it's the last time he's ever going to see me alive. He leans forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his upper body slouching until he's almost folded on them.
but he hides it so damn well. He seems so bubbly carefree all the time, and then the smallest thing comes along, the littlest whiff of trouble, and it's like he crumbles under his own anxiety. I'm not trying to feed that response in him, all I can think to do is comfort him. It's like an instinct. I just don't have anything else, Tony.
He cradles his forehead in his metal hand, defeated.
God, Tony, he doesn't even know. He has no idea how important he is to me. I know his anxiety gives him all these crazy ideas, but it's insane to me that after all this, after everything we've been through, he could ever think there's anything on this goddamn earth I'd choose over him. He's my son. Anxiety makes us question everything, even things that should be absolute fact. He knows you love him. It's just the trauma talking when he gets scared like that.
He kind of looks like he wants to reach over the coffee table and pat Bucky's shoulder or something, but instead he mirrors Bucky's hunched over position and offers, "It's going to get easier, Buck. You guys aren't on your own anymore. When this whole mess is over and we take you home, we can go from there. It'll be easier when you guys move into the tower. You'll both have other people around to spend time with, pretty much all the time. And if we need to get a doctor's opinion, then we will. This isn't something you gotta solve all by yourself." He smiles at him, and Bucky tries his best to return it, touched by the sight. "And Peter's still young," he continues. "He'll start wanting to spend more time with his friends and less with his parents, and then he'll be crying on my couch because he's giving you the cold shoulder instead of clinging to you 24/7.
Bucky glares at him.
"I am not crying."
A teasing, shit-eating smirk is his only reply before Tony returns to his work and Bucky returns to his window, his mind racing, his heart filled with tentative hope despite the ache. When Peter and Steve finally join them inside hours later, it's to present the beautiful hand-painted bird feeder they assembled together for Peter's bedroom window. Peter displays it proudly when they walk in, and Bucky catches Steve's gaze and smiles at him warmly as Peter gives him the excited rundown of the entire building process. The four have dinner and watch TV together before bed, and Bucky can feel Steve lingering behind him as he says goodnight to Peter, the man practically vibrating on the balls of his feet. They manage to keep their hands off each other until they make it back to Steve's room, but the moment the door is shut, Steve is crowding him against it and kissing him, his ends dangling in Bucky's long hair. "God, I wanted to do this all day," he hisses, biting softly at Bucky's lip. "You have no idea how hard it is to keep my hands off you. It's like torture."
"Sweet dogger,"
Bucky jokes, hands trailing down to Steve's ass and groping it through his jeans, wanting nothing more than to pull them down.
"Consider this your torture lifting,"
he says before sucking a deep bruise into Steve's throat, his hands tightening when Steve moans before they walk backwards to the bed and one or both of them pulls the other down eagerly. It takes 2 more days of Steve and Tony going back and forth over their counterproposal before they finally have a draft they're both totally happy with, and, Tony adds snappishly, can easily defend in court. There's no news from T'Challa regarding Zemo or his location, so reluctantly, Steve agrees to the meeting Tony sets up with Ross and the other key members of the UN Council to formally present their counterproposal alongside the rest of the Avengers. "This is going to be a shit show," Steve sighs as he finishes folding his Captain America uniform into his bag, his face tight with displeasure. "God, I wish you were coming with me."
"So do I,"
Bucky says, running a comforting hand down his back.
"We'll be here when you get back. And next time you have to make the trip home, all this will be over and I'll be going with you."
"I can't wait," Steve says earnestly, turning and pulling Bucky in for a kiss by the nape of his neck.
"Oh, cool, alright? And you'll probably see us on the news anyway. Tony says the media's all over this thing." "Doesn't surprise me."
Bucky grins playfully.
"You're something of a celebrity, Captain."
Steve groans.
"Don't start with me." "Yes, sir."
They share a laugh, Steve letting his forehead fall against Bucky's shoulder like he's garnering up the strength to leave their room. Bucky simply holds him in his arms, soaking up the physical contact since he has to go without it for the next couple of days.
"We'll celebrate when you get back,"
he promises, pressing a kiss to the man's shoulder.
"We'll watch the season finale of Game of Thrones and watch Tony get wine drunk again."
Steve laughs against his neck, sending tingling waves over his skin.
"That sounds great," he says as he pulls away unenthusiastically. "I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too."
They share a soft kiss, light and unhurried, just a gentle token of affection.
Bucky follows Steve out into the entryway where Tony is waiting, sunglasses on and phone in hand, a sleepy, embedded Peter yawning beside him.
Have a safe trip,
Peter says to them, leaning against Bucky's side when standing proves to be too difficult for his sleep-addled brain. Both Tony and Steve give the kid matching fond looks, Steve ruffling his already messy hair, and Tony smirking as he says,
"We will. Go get some more sleep before you fall over."
"'Kay," Peter replies, eyes already closed, letting Bucky take almost all his weight. With that, the two men leave, and as soon as Bucky watches their car drive away, he's guiding Peter over to the couches and depositing him on one of them to go back to sleep. Peter's out before his head even touches the cushion, so Bucky drapes a blanket over him and takes a seat on the adjacent armchair, watching the sun finish rising over the lake, the herons flying low over the water. It feels almost odd to be alone with Peter after these last couple of weeks of being here. The mansion felt overwhelmingly large when it was the 3 or 4 of them, but with just the two, it's almost daunting how empty it feels. There's a deep, eerie silence that seems to descend on the house like a cloud of fog, as if the very structure of the building is suddenly noise-canceling. Peter and Bucky keep busy as they pass the time waiting for T'Challa to call, or Steve and Tony to come back. They cook, they play games. Peter catches him up on the entire Disney Masterpiece collection, now that he has internet readily at his fingertips. The first night they cook dinner at the campfire again, something Bucky is quickly realizing has become a favorite of Peter's, and the day after that they play in the lake and Bucky finds a book from Tony's library to occupy himself while Peter wanders the garden, taking photos with his camera. Bucky's surprised to realize he feels lonely without Steve and Tony, even though Peter is almost always beside him. A few weeks ago, he would have jumped at the chance to be left alone with his son without the other two men circling around him like vultures. And now the house is deafeningly quiet, and the remoteness of the lake and forest around them feels more like a prison than the wide-open wilderness it really is. They watch Steve and Tony on the news the second day, just like Steve had suspected they would. The media coverage is vague at best and frustratingly basic at worst, though it does offer a shot of the Avengers sitting behind their bench at the UN's conference, all in uniform and wearing matching tight-lipped expressions. Bucky wants to call Steve the moment he sees his face, wants to make sure he's okay, but it's uplifting listening to Tony's snark and banter with the infamous Thaddeus Ross in a way that makes the man's pale face burn red behind his podium. When the broadcast is over, they head outside simply to escape the suffocating feeling of staying inside their silent mansion. Taking pictures of the birds and butterflies slowly turns into cloud gazing from the under the dock, and when Peter can't sit still any longer, they take their baseball mitts and ball and head to the field beyond the forest to play catch. The afternoon sun is hot as it beats down on them, but Peter doesn't let that stop him from diving for the ball no matter how far Bucky chucks it. Both of them treat it like a training exercise, trying to burn off some of that pent-up energy flowing inside of them. They make a game of it, the way they used to back in Queens, and after a few hours of playing catch and some light sparring to keep their reflexes up, Peter finally collapses into the long grass, exhausted. Bucky laughs, not even able to see the kid from how tall the grass in the field is. Peter looks like a groundhog when his head pops back up, and he sluggishly pulls his body up and drags himself over to where Bucky's standing, his skin damp with sweat. "I wish we could go horseback riding again," Peter says, taking a seat beside Bucky on a steep little hill where the grass is just slightly shorter. Orby rolls around him cheerfully, then bounces up the hill just so he can roll down it again over and over like it's a slide. "Can we go again after this is all over?"
"Definitely,"
Bucky says, wrapping his arm around his kid's shoulders as they watch a breeze ripple through the field. They listen to the waves crash against the bottom of the short cliff they're perched on for a quiet, serene moment. Orby nudging against his foot, Bucky lowering his metal hand and letting the bot wrap around it like a bird returning to its nest.
"Steve wants to go again, too."
Peter leans against his side, relaxes into his chest. "You really like him," he says. His face heats up and Bucky coughs, clearing his throat to try and dislodge the awkwardness that's suddenly taken root there.
"Yeah, I do."
"I'm glad," Peter says, closing his eyes when Bucky idly strokes his metal hand through his curls. "And not just because I get to tell people my dad is dating Captain America." Bucky laughs, ruffling the boy's head a little harder before an intrusive thought hits him and he goes cold.
"On your
he says, pausing to rethink his words. not sure how to say it right.
You're alright that Steve's a man. That doesn't bother you, does it?
Peter sits up straight, raising an eyebrow at Bucky like he just started speaking a foreign language. What? Dad, of course that doesn't bother me, he says, almost like he's insulting. Do you really think I'd be upset about something like that?
No.
Bucky smiles, pulling the boy back against his side.
I don't think so, Pete. I just wanted to make sure.
Peter's quiet under his arm, then asks curiously, would it bother you if I dated a man?
Yes.
Bucky says immediately, feeling Peter laugh against his side a little shit.
A man? No way in hell. Not until you're 35 at least. But a kid your own age? Also no, just please give me time before you start bringing anyone home, Pete. Man or woman, you can love whoever you want when you're older.
Neil! Peter says, still laughing warmly against his chest, bringing a smile to Bucky's face too. They sit for a while longer watching the lake and the field on either side of them, just basking in the afternoon sun and the cool breeze drifting over them, listening to the waves below them and the chorus of birds above them. It's soothing being out here, his son under his arm and nothing but wildlife all around them. He wishes Steve were here, but other than that, it's a perfect moment. He hugs Peter a little tighter against him, content to let it last forever. But Peter sits up again and pushes himself to his feet. I'm gonna go grab something to drink, he says, shuffling down the hall. Bucky notices a white line on the back of his neck where his shirt is pressed against his skin and calls after him.
Put on some more sunscreen while you're at it.
Okay. He watches him go until he disappears into the mouth of the forest, following the trail back onto the estate grounds and totally out of sight. Bucky stretches out on the grass as he waits, a cloud rolling over the sun and darkening the green field with murky shade. It's the splash of water he hears first. Everything is rhythmic on the field. The grass and trees blowing in the wind, the waves rolling against the base of the cliff. Even the birds call in predictable notes if you've been listening long enough to be able to tell. Bucky's cataloged every sound in this remote corner of the world of theirs, so it's the splash he hears first. It's a forceful splash against the current, loud and sloshing at the base of the cliff. Bucky doesn't know what's wrong. He doesn't know why he gets to his feet, why the sick feeling of dread has started pumping through his veins with every erratic beat of his heart. Something is coming. He doesn't know what, but the slosh of water on the cliffside has his instincts screaming at him to run. And then it comes from the water. The cliff is barely taller than a man. Bucky thinks it's a bear at first, just this amorphous black shape climbing over the ledge of the cliff and onto the grass in front of him. But as it pulls itself up straight, Bucky realizes it's a human being dressed in light but durable tactical gear, a black gun with a heavy-duty silencer sitting heavily in his palms. He's not wearing a mask. He lifts his face and meets Bucky's gaze, stares straight ahead at him, expressionless. It's Zemo. Bucky doesn't have a chance to move or dodge as he lifts the gun. It fires, the silencer producing a loud explosive pop, but no more as the bullet slices through the air toward him. Bucky doesn't move in time to block the shot. But Orby does! It stuns him, both of them judging by the look on Zemo's face, when his hand swipes in front of him easily, knocking the bullet away with a sharp metallic clink. They stare at each other for a moment, the gun still raised, before Zemo scowls and starts to pull something from the pocket of his vest.
I don't know what Hydra did to you.
Bucky says, his hands up, trying to de-escalate the situation. He keeps his peripheral vision locked onto the mouth of the forest, terrified that any moment Peter will come sprinting through.
But I never wanted to do anything they forced me to. It was mind control. I never wanted to be their bloodhound. Whatever they forced me to do to you, I'm sorry.
They didn't force you to do anything to me, Zemo says. Bucky places the accent immediately. Sokovian? Why the hell? They know all about the mind control, James. Bucky feels sick at the sight of the little red notebook Zemo pulls from his pocket, the black Hydra insignia painted on the front. He knows that book. He knows what it means. No, he thinks desperately, taking a step back. Zemo keeps the gun pointed at him as he flips the book open to a page that's already marked. Logging? Bucky turns and runs. He heads for the forest, for the path that leads to the mansion, planning to just take Peter and run. But Zemo fires his gun again, and Orby yanks Bucky down to the ground to avoid the shot, knocking the wind out of him with a sharp gasp. Rusted?
Stop,
Bucky says, rolling over and pushing himself up, his teeth bared like a caged animal.
Stop it!
Furnace.
With a desperate shout, Bucky lunges forward, but Zemo lurches back and fires 2 more shots, shouting,
Daybreak 17!
As Orby once again pulls him out of the way to avoid both bullets. Police, Bucky says, dirt and grass tangling in his hands and hair as he pushes himself back up. But his body feels so weak. He can feel the roaring in his head. The fury is pounding like someone's using his brain as a drum, striking him over and over.
Stop, please.
Bid 9.
Orby,
Bucky gasps helplessly.
Call for help. Call Steve. Call Tony. T'Challa, can you...
9.
There's no reply, but he feels a slight vibration in his arm from the tip of his fingers to his elbow. He remembers Tony telling him that Orby can only speak in binary and prays the robot was able to send the message for him.
Homecoming.
Bucky pushes himself onto shaky legs, turning to face Zemo, his chest heaving. He clenches his jaw to stop himself from screaming at the pain that racks his body, his mind a searing, agonizing sea of white that makes him want to dig the heels of his palms into his eyes to block it out.
1.
He wobbles on his feet, then desperately a last-ditch effort lunges for the man's gun. Zemo fires, or removes his hand. Good butt, he thinks, knocking the bullet away, sending it flying behind him. And then he hears the gasp. Zemo's face falls, his gun lowering slightly. He's not looking at Bucky. Bucky turns, his vision blurry and his mind screaming. But there's a cold moment of clarity when he turns and sees Peter behind him, arms raised, web shooters aimed and ready to fire. But his face is all wrong, almost blank. His eyes are wide but not in fear. Red soaks into the dark blue material of Peter's shirt, soaking his entire stomach. And then Bucky's screaming. He runs, doesn't make it in time before Peter hits the ground. Peter gasps for breath, his hands tightly fisted in the blood-soaked cotton of his shirt, a desperate, fearful whine leaving his lips as everything starts turning red, 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 red. His hands, his clothes, the grass he's lying on.
Peter,
Bucky says, broken and frantic, pulling Peter into his arms, flinching when he cries out in pain.
Oh God, no, no, Peter, let me see.
His head is pounding, he can't think, and there's no time.
There's so much blood, it's too much. This is too much blood. Move your hands, I've got you. Let me see.
Peter sobs loudly as Bucky tries to lift him. He's tense with pain and fear in his arms, but all Bucky can focus on is that red. He presses his hand to the wound, but it's gone through. There's an exit wound. It's bleeding too much. He has to stop it now. Bucky wraps his arms tightly around the boy, sobbing at the scream of pain that leaves Peter's lips. Dad! He sobs, teeth clenching around a desperate whine as Bucky tries to cover both his wounds to stem the blood. And then there's an exhale, the smallest, weakest breath. Bucky doesn't even think he would have heard it if he didn't have Peter's face pressed against his bicep, cradled in his arms. He looks up at the boy's face, but Peter's eyes are closed. His limbs go loose. He slumps like dead weight in his lap.
Peter,
Bucky says urgently. He needs to wake him up. He can't sleep right now. They have to stop the bleeding.
Peter, kiddo, wake up, come on.
He cups the boy's face with his left hand, tries to gently shake him awake. Peter doesn't move, but that's not what makes Bucky scream. His fingertips brush against the boy's throat as he holds his head up, and through the metal of his hand he feels it. There's no pulse. No! Bucky lowers his head to the boy's chest, hugs him so tightly he can feel his bones creak from the pressure. The side of his face presses hard against his chest, and then Bucky's sobbing, open and guttural and so loud it makes his own ears ring. There's no heartbeat. He hears himself begging, echoing off the empty field and the empty lake and the empty world all around him.
No, don't do this to me, Peter, don't do this.
He can't breathe, he can't feel anything but the lifeless weight in his arms.
Please, please, don't do this to me, Peter. God, please, no.
A shadow falls over them, Zemo standing behind him and blocking out the sun. He almost sounds remorseful.
Freight car.
And everything goes white.